Hello, welcome to the Persuasive Faith channel. My name is Rick Harvey, and I am the teacher of an adult class at Trinity Baptist Church in Norman, Oklahoma, in which we explore questions and objections which people might have as to the credibility of the Christian faith. We call it Persuasive Faith. This is a one-year-long class that we provide for the members of our church, and we are now in our 6th year of providing the class. Of course, normally we meet in a classroom setting, but due to the current coronavirus restrictions, we are now, at least temporarily, we hope, meeting online, and we are using the Zoom format to facilitate that. Of course, the Zoom program makes it quite easy to make a video of the class, which we are doing, and then making that video available online to members of the class who may have missed a class or who wish to repeat some material, or to anyone else who might enjoy the class. I have edited the video down to include only the instructional portion of our time. Incidentally, we also have a website at persuasivefaith.org where you can access an audio podcast of all of our lessons throughout the year, as well as other things like class handouts and other resources. I hope you'll find this video informative and worthwhile, and if you do, don't hesitate to hit the like button so that other people on YouTube can know that there's material here that they might also find beneficial. So God bless, and here's today's video. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Okay, so we are moving through our section on historical issues related to apologetics. And last week we talked about the early years of Christianity. So basically from Pentecost up to the conversion of Constantine, so early part of the 4th century. And we dealt with various issues that come up and questions that people have or objections that people have about Christianity regarding that era. Now, today what I want to do is I want to move forward from Constantine and into what we call the medieval era or the Middle Ages. And primarily what I want to talk about today is the relationship of Christianity to the progress and the development of Western civilization. And there are just a number of misunderstandings that people have about this and falsehoods, false things that people raise about Christianity and its role in Western civilization during this era. So those are the things we want to talk about today. Again, some resources there for you in your notes. Rodney Stark is a sociologist and historian from, actually teaches at Baylor. And he has written a number of books regarding to history and religion and that sort of thing. But two in particular, one is How the West Won, deals a lot with what we're talking about today. And a book I just got of his just recently, and I've just read a couple chapters of it so far, but it looks to be really good, is The Triumph of Christianity. Then David Bentley Hart has written a book, Atheist Delusions, in which he addresses many of the false ideas that people have about Christianity's role in Western civilization. James Hannon's book, God's Philosophers, looks at how the medieval Christian philosophers, scientists, actually laid the foundation for all modern science. The term philosopher, somebody needs to mute their audio there. We're getting some noise from somebody. I don't know who it is. At any rate, the term philosophers in the Middle Ages doesn't refer to just the field of philosophy that we think about today, but also includes science. They were really all together as kind of one academic endeavor and intellectual endeavor during the Middle Ages. And then John Mark Reynolds has written a book, When Athens Met Jerusalem, And he talks about just the interaction of Greek thought and Christian thought during these early centuries. So those are all very good resources that I've benefited from. So what are some of these ideas that people have that really create a misperception about Christianity? And there are a number of them. One of them just goes back to how people view the Roman Empire before the advent of Christianity. And they view Rome and the Roman Empire as this really vibrant, growing, dynamic, intellectually dynamic culture that existed until Christianity somehow brought it to an end. And Christianity precipitated the fall of the Roman Empire. And then the idea is that when the empire fell, when the Roman Empire fell, Christianity kind of becomes dominant at that point in Western civilization, and the entire European Western civilization culture then is plunged into this 1,000-long-year period that they call the Dark Ages, okay? The so-called, quote, age of faith as opposed to the age of reason. So the idea there is that Christianity caused the fall of Rome and then precipitated this millennial-long period of just kind of moribund intellectual stagnation and that sort of thing, because because civilization was so preoccupied with dogma and faith, and those are seen as antithetical to reason and logic and that sort of thing. And then the idea is not only did Christianity precipitate this Dark Ages, but that the church actually suppressed any kind of cultural or scientific progress for 1,000 years. And that then this opposition to what we might call profane learning or secular learning, non-religious issues, that this basically was kind of an animosity towards that kind of learning, and that finds its expression. An example of that would be in the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, Egypt, at the end of the 4th century, towards the end of the 4th century, in which 700,000 volumes of ancient works were destroyed in a fire when they burned the library. You can imagine the loss of 700,000 ancient documents and ancient scrolls and books. It's just would be a terrible loss to civilization. But then finally, this age of faith, this age of dogma, gives way to the age of reason with the Renaissance. And suddenly, Western civilization breaks itself free of this bondage to religious dogma and embarks on this tremendous period of growth and discovery, and leads from the Renaissance and then into the Enlightenment and on from there. And kind of the epitome, the ultimate picture or illustration of this war between science and religion is the trial of Galileo, or the trial and the imprisonment of Galileo. And this is a picture that many people still have today of this whole era. And there have been there's just been a long line of people who have contributed to this particular view or understanding of Christianity throughout history. And it begins quite early. Zosimus was in 5th century, early 6th century pagan author, and he was very antagonistic towards Christianity, and he portrayed the history of Christianity in a very, very negative light. Coming forward a number of centuries, you have, during the French Enlightenment, you have, of course, one of the leading Enlightenment figures was Voltaire, very antagonistic to Christianity, particularly to Rome, and he repeats a lot of these ideas or thoughts about Christianity throughout history that you get from Zosimus. Edward Gibbon, who's famous for his History and Decline of the Fall of the Roman Empire, very famous work on the history of the Roman Empire. He repeats a lot of these same ideas. You move forward into the 19th century. A guy by the name of Draper writes a book that was very popular and very influential at the time, The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. Thomas Huxley, another 19th century figure, is sometimes called Darwin's bulldog, was very prominent in the early debate about Darwinism. Very pro Darwin and agnostic, of course, and also repeats many of these ideas about Christianity and history. And then coming forward into the 20th century, we have Bertrand Russell, who's a famous British philosopher, what you call a polymath. He was a mathematician and historian and philosopher, and very influential in the 20th century. Sometimes referred to himself as an agnostic, sometimes referred to himself as an atheist, but he also repeats many of these ideas. So what is the real history? Well, one of the very earliest things we need to be familiar with is something called the Greek miracle. So we go back into ancient Greece, and you have initially with Greece, you have a number of what are called city-states. You have these very independent city-states that are independent of one another. And beginning in about 600 BC to about 300 BC, you have this remarkable kind of explosion of technological, literary, political, even military progress and discovery, and it's just a very dynamic time intellectually with the Greeks, up to about 300 BC. And you can really think of the Greek miracle as kind of the beginning of what we call the road to modernity. So modernity is the way the world is today. So with all of our concepts of democracy and freedom and our modern technology and science and that sort of thing, all of that's part of what we call modernity. And the Greek miracle is kind of the beginning of the road to modernity. But what happens in about 300 BC is that whole Greek miracle just kind of peters out. And the reason apparently for that is it's at about this time that the Greeks start moving from this kind of city-state political arrangement into the idea of empire. And so you start beginning to get these the Greek empires. So you get like the Athenian Empire. And what happens with this move towards empire is the energies and the passions that were previously invested in all of this intellectual dynamism is expended now in the energy of the empire. So the maintenance of the empire begins to detract from all this intellectual prowess, and the Greek miracle basically comes to an end. However, much of the learning and much of the ideas and thoughts that exist in Greek thought at this time, then is when Christianity comes along a few centuries later, and Christians start looking at some of these things, and they see in Greek thought a lot of compatibility with Christian thought. And so the early church fathers are very interested in all of this Greek learning, and so a lot of it is preserved then by the church, even though Greece itself is not as interested in preserving it. The church tends to preserve it. And then of course the Greek empires then are subsumed into the Roman Empire, and you have the development of the Roman Empire. And And this idea that Rome is this very intellectually dynamic culture in and of itself is actually misleading, because what happened was when Rome conquers the Greek Empire, then this kind of Greek knowledge and these Greek resources get subsumed into the Roman Empire. So basically many of the things that are attributed to the Romans actually come originally from the Greek and from the Greek miracle. But then with Rome, you have the same phenomena that you had with Greece, is that this kind of residual dynamism that Rome gets from Greece kind of peters out with Rome also when Rome moves into its empire phase. So we're talking in the century or two before the Christian era. And then eventually, of course, Rome in the early part of the 5th century, Rome itself falls. And historians really don't know why Rome fell. And they really, there's one German historian back in the 80s who studied, and he actually found that historians attribute over 200 different causes to the fall of Rome. So clearly historians really don't understand, or at least haven't come to an agreement on ultimately what caused the fall of Rome. But oftentimes it's argued that Rome fell from some kind of internal failure. And there's really no evidence that that's the case. We do know, of course, that Rome fell militarily, and we know when. But there's no real agreement as to some kind of internal cause of Rome's failure. So particularly, there's no indication that Christianity in any way contributed to the fall of Rome. And in fact, while all this is going on with Rome and the western end of the Roman Empire, you have the eastern end of the Roman Empire, which is Byzantium, and headquartered, of course, in Constantinople, and it lasts for another 1,000 years. So here you have the eastern end of the Roman Empire, which is at least as influenced by Christianity as the western, if not more so, and it lasts for 1,000 years longer. So it's hard to understand how Christianity could be the fall of the Western Empire and not the cause of the fall of the Eastern Empire. But one of the things that does seem to be the cause of the military collapse or the military fall of Rome were some kind of long-running strategic military policies. So you have several military issues kind of going on at the same time. So in the early part of the 4th century, Rome made some strategic changes in how they defended the perimeter of the empire. And I don't have time to go into those. They're kind of fascinating. But these have now been in place. As I said, they were put in place in the earlier part of the 4th century. Rome ultimately falls in the early part of the 5th century. And these altered strategic policies had the unintended consequence, eventually over a period of decades, of diminishing of the Roman soldiers' military training. So there was a de-emphasis on military training and a de-emphasis on military discipline. And this, of course, has a profound impact when the Northern Europeans then finally do attack. In addition to that, the Northern Europeans, whom the Romans called the barbarians because they didn't speak Greek or Latin, so they're referred to as the barbarians. When they attack, they're actually now doing so with greatly improved military tactics that they have developed in the recent century or so. And not only that, but many of the leading military figures among the barbarians were former Roman soldiers. So they had been trained by Rome, And of course, they were also very familiar with Roman tactics and that sort of thing. So all of these things contribute then ultimately to the success of the barbarians in invading the Roman Empire and eventually to the conquest of Rome itself. So then the argument is, well, when Rome fell, then all this intellectual dynamism came to a halt, and you have these dark ages, and then nothing happens for 1,000 years. And this simply is not true. There were tremendous strides and progress made, beginning shortly after the fall of Rome and then accelerating on through the medieval era. So, for example, you get tremendous progress in the area of agriculture. So one invention that developed shortly after the fall of Rome is the development of the iron plow. So you can imagine when farmers stop using wooden plows and start using iron plows, what a difference that makes for our agriculture. You can imagine how much easier it is to plow, how much longer the plows can last, how much more land you can plow, that sort of thing. They also developed the padded horse collar. So, these things seem so, we just take them for granted today. But this was a major breakthrough. They discovered that if they padded the collar that they put around a horse, the horse could pull more weight, could work longer, could work harder. They didn't have to use oxen now. They could use horses who could plow faster. And so breakthroughs in agriculture like this enabled the Europeans to grow many more crops, and this ultimately resulted in a population boom because they were able to feed more people. You have a breakthrough in the area of industry, the use of wind power and the use of water power. And the Romans, they knew about wind power, they knew about water power, but they never developed it. And the reason they didn't develop it comes back to this issue of empire, is as an empire, as it's spreading out, it's defeating these other peoples and other countries, other nations, and they defeat them, they bring all these slaves in. So they're importing all these slaves into the empire. So quite honestly, they didn't need wind power. They didn't need water power. They didn't need to invest in that kind of technology because they had slaves to do the work. And it's only then as slavery fades out, as we talked about in our lesson on slavery then, that there's a very strong impetus to develop the technology of windmills and the technology of water wheels and things like that, which happens in the early part of the medieval era. There's breakthroughs in the area of transportation. It's not until after the fall of the Roman Empire that people figured out that they could put brakes on wagon wheels. Yeah, and you think about, these are these things we just assume people knew all along, but they didn't. And these discoveries were made after the fall of the Roman Empire. The ability to make the front axle of a wagon swivel. So up until then, the front axle was stationary. So you can imagine every time a wagon turned, it's literally dragging the wheels, as you can imagine it would do as it turns. But suddenly somebody discovers and figures out, hey, wait a minute, we can put that axle on a pivot and it can turn. And so these are just tremendous advances in the area of transportation. And then there's advances in the area of arts. There's advances in the area of warfare. So, for example, this is a fascinating thing to me. Up until this period, the medieval period, the cavalry in military units on their horses, they just had like a flat saddle, a piece of leather or a piece of fabric or whatever, or else they just went bareback. Okay, so that dramatically limited what a military person on a horse could do. And in this early period of the medieval period, they discovered, wait a minute, we can put a stirrup on a saddle, and that'll give us something to hold on to when we're at war and when we're fighting, so we don't get it knocked off our horses easily. And then they figured out that they could put kind of a little bit of a back on the saddle, so you had something to kind of rest your back again, which made you much more stable in warfare. And then they discovered the stirrup, and you could instead of just having your feet hanging loose or trying to hold on to the belly of the horse, you had stirrups that you could put your feet in, and it made it possible for you to stand and use your body in warfare. And this gave a tremendous advantage to Europeans in conflict. And this advantage goes on clear into the period of the Crusades that we'll talk about next week, that the European Crusaders had their cavalry had tremendous advantage over Islamic cavalry because they had these innovations in the saddle and the stirrup. These are all breakthroughs in the early medieval period. Now, but one of the areas that was a setback had to do with this area of Greek knowledge and Greek learning. So, of course, as I said, most of the real intellectual prowess at the time was all written in Greek. Okay, so all over the Greek world, really the substantial part of the knowledge and understanding was written in Greek. But when the barbarians, the Northern Europeans, come down and they conquer the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, Greek over the next century or two just completely dies out. The people's knowledge of Greek just dies out. And this leaves Westerners with very little access to this wealth of Greek knowledge that had existed for centuries. However, in the eastern part of the empire, that's still thriving, this Greek knowledge still retains. So Eastern Christianity still has access to all of this Greek knowledge, but you really lose it in the West and in Western civilization. But then you get the onslaught of the Islamic conquest. So as elements of the Byzantine Empire fall progressively to Islam, then all of this Greek learning and Greek knowledge falls into the hands of the Arabic conquest, or the Islamic conquest, I should say, and it becomes an element within Arabic societies. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But eventually, after a number of centuries, Western thinkers then regain a knowledge of Greek. So they start studying Greek, they start learning Greek, and that gives them access to Greek learning and Greek knowledge that they hadn't had access to for centuries. And so then you do get a flowering within the West. You get a flowering of knowledge and of inquiry and philosophy and things like that, because once again, thinkers in the West have access to this Greek learning. But there is an element that we just take so much for granted today that is really a part of this whole development in the West, that to many of us is really quite foreign to think it could be any other way. And it's the whole idea of the possibility of progress. Now, we've taken this idea of progress a little too far, I think, in Western civilization, particularly in the last century or two. But this, the way Stark puts it, he says, the idea of progress was inherent in Jewish conceptions of history and was central to Christian thought from the early days. So this whole idea that progress is even possible and that progress is desirable is a good thing, generally speaking. This whole idea of progress is a central idea within the Judeo-Christian worldview. And we go, well, okay, so what? Well, the point is that this idea, this European idea of progress, is unique in human history. So until the spread of Christianity, of course, you had it with the Jews in their little kind of enclave, but until the spread of Christianity, this idea of human progress and of the progress of human flourishing, this idea is foreign anywhere else in the world. It's a completely new concept. And part of this goes back to something we've talked about a number of times before, which is that in the non-Christian world, non-Jewish world, pretty much throughout the world, history is viewed, as we said, circular as opposed to linear. So in the pagan world, in the Eastern world, history is viewed as circular. It's just repeating itself. And that's opposed, of course, to the linear view within Judaism and Christianity, which is that history has a beginning point and that history is moving towards a telos. It's moving towards an end. It's moving towards a purpose, towards accomplishing something, okay? So this whole idea of the movement of history is the idea of progress. And this is completely foreign to most people in the world. So this idea of the progression of knowledge, even the progression of theology, is a characteristic of Western civilization that is completely unknown in most parts of the world. So what you get then during the medieval period is you get just an extensive amount of scientific discovery, technological advances, as I've mentioned, advances in the field of philosophy and things like that. So that when we get to the later centuries, when we get to the Renaissance and beyond the Renaissance, and we get to kind of the development of modern science, we have to keep in mind that every major scientific breakthrough that comes in those later centuries is built upon very profound, significant discoveries and developments that occurred during the medieval era, that era that is has been so oftentimes referred to as the Dark Ages. So this progress that's made during the medieval era is not just kind of incidental and occasional, but it's very profound, it's very extensive, and as I say, it eclipsed anything that was going on anywhere else in the world. But then you have this myth of the Dark Ages. So this idea then that develops, and particularly is propagated in the Enlightenment, has been very dominant in Western thinking since then, is this idea that nothing of real intellectual or scientific or technological or artistic or philosophical importance or significance occurred and in that period of 1,000 years. And that's chiefly due to Christianity's preoccupation with dogma and its resistance to progress. So faith is viewed as a direct antithesis to reason. Of course, we talked about this back in our lessons on philosophy and why that's false. So Christianity was viewed to be at war with science. And as I mentioned, that's epitomized in the persecution of Galileo. But the reality is that nowadays, virtually all historians of that era totally reject the idea of the Dark Ages. So most historians today just totally dismiss that whole idea because they realize it's just simply not true. So you have then this medieval era that is very vibrant, very dynamic. And one of the things is that we need to realize is that instead of it being something that the church was opposed to, virtually all of this intellectual dynamic growth was fostered by the church and was financed by the church. And most of it was taking place in universities. Now, the university is a Western creation. It's a Western invention. So you have the creation of the university in the medieval era. And the universities were invented by Christians. They were financed and supported by the church. And most of this dynamic intellectual activity that was going on in the medieval era was going on in these universities that were being supported and financed by Christianity. Let me just throw in something here. It's not in your notes. I want to be clear. When I'm talking about Christianity, I'm talking about the Christian worldview. Obviously, much of this involves Roman Catholicism. Okay, so I'm not talking about the fine points of Christian theology here. When I'm talking about Christians, I'm not necessarily talking about people who are born again in the sense that we as evangelicals would think of. But rather, when I'm using the term Christians and I'm using the term church, I'm referring to the Christian worldview. So although, so we might have serious differences with Catholics on some very important critical theological issues, including the doctrine of salvation, we do hold an essentially similar worldview. And so that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who hold to this Christian worldview. So, as I pointed this out before, nearly all of the great intellectual minds of the medieval era that laid the foundation for everything that came after, virtually all of them were Christians. There were a few who were not, but virtually all of them were Christians. So the church, throughout the whole medieval era and through the Renaissance, has a history of supporting and encouraging scientific inquiry and intellectual endeavors and that sort of thing. The church was the chief patron of science. All the early universities were founded and supported by the church. Virtually all the early scientists, including Copernicus and Galileo, were Christians. So that, again, Stark says, contrary to the conventional narrative, science did not suddenly flourish once Europe cast aside religious superstitions during the so-called Enlightenment. Science arose in the West, and only in the West, precisely because the Judeo-Christian conception of God encouraged and even demanded this pursuit. So one of the things that's to me so exciting is that these early Christian thinkers and these medieval Christian thinkers, they didn't just invest their lives in scientific discovery and scientific exploration because it was possible and exciting, but they actually felt an obligation under God to do so. They felt like God wanted them to pursue these things and learn these things and discover these things. And Stark brings that out in that quote. So I've been claiming here, and Stark claims, that this happened in the West and nowhere else in the world. Well, is that true? And people might bring up a couple different cases that they might argue would counter that point. So for example, in the Far East, and particularly in China, we do know that in ancient times, the Chinese developed things like gunpowder and cannons and mechanical clocks and even a printing press and that sort of thing. And there's questions about whether or not some of these things, whether or not Westerners learned those things from China or whether they developed them independently. Okay, and there's debate among historians on that. But it is clear that the Chinese did come up with some pretty remarkable inventions very, very early on. But what's fascinating with the Chinese is that although they developed these things, or where they invented these things, they never developed them. They didn't understand or perceive how these things could be used to advance human flourishing. So you get some really curious things that happen with the Chinese. So you get the invention of the mechanical clock, which to us is a major breakthrough in human flourishing. But once it's invented in China, the court mandarins ordered all the clocks destroyed because they somehow perceived it as a threat to society and a threat to culture. And then you have this fascinating Chinese explorer, Zheng He, in the 15th century, and he develops these boats that are capable of being ocean-going vessels. And he engages in this exploration where he gets in his now seaworthy vessels that he has designed and built, and he sails around the southern end of China, around the Southeast Asia area, and sails all the way over to Africa in exploration. And he gets to Africa, and he even gets some of the exotic animals from Africa and stuff, and then he takes them back to China. So you get this kind of major Chinese exploration going on for about 20 years. And then the Chinese emperor decides that this is somehow not a good thing, and he bans any further exploration, and he prohibits the building of any more seaworthy vessels, and he destroys all of Zheng He's ships. So here again, you see this lack of a concept of progress. So you get these tremendous developments, but the Chinese don't know what to do with them. But when Europe acquires them, whether they get them from China or they develop them independently, with Europeans, they go, hey, we can really use this stuff and we can make progress. And so that's why we say this idea of progress is unique to the West. So it was left up to the Christian West to appreciate the value of these kinds of developments and these kind of discoveries, and then to develop them further, and thereby to enhance Western society and even Western power and influence. The other example that is sometimes used is the flourishing of knowledge in the Islamic world during the medieval era. And the common view here is that while the West was plunged into this dismal dark ages, that in the Islamic world you have all this kind of tremendous flourishing of philosophy and of science and mathematics and things like that. But in reality, what's happened here is that, as I mentioned, during the Islamic conquest, as they're coming across, particularly into the Byzantine Empire, as they're coming across, they're conquering these peoples who have all of this knowledge, all of this Greek learning. And these conquered peoples, as we talked about before, are called Dhimmis, D-H-I-M-M-I-N-I-S, okay? So these are the conquered peoples. And so they are then being absorbed into the Islamic culture and into the Arabic culture. And they're getting absorbed into this, and they're bringing with them all of this great knowledge and understanding and wisdom from the Greeks. And so they're coming into the Islamic world, and they are learning Arabic. And then over a period of centuries, they become more Arabic. They begin to speak Arabic, and they're translating much of this Greek learning into Arabic. And so it gives the appearance that all of this dynamic knowledge is Arabic and Islamic in origin, when it is not. It is, in fact, something that's been brought in from the Byzantine Empire, okay? And to illustrate the truthfulness of this, what happens is, as the centuries progress and the Dhimmis become totally absorbed into Arabic culture and into the Islamic religion, as they become totally absorbed into this and they adopt the Islamic worldview, all of this intellectual dynamism dies out. So we don't think of the Islamic world today as being intellectually dynamic. You cannot think of a Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard or Yale or Stanford anywhere in the Islamic world. Okay, they have universities, but they don't have any major universities, world-leading universities like you have in the West. And so you don't have any of that dynamism that was characteristic of the Islamic world in the medieval era right after the conquest. And the reason is because as these Dhimmis absorbed and assumed the Islamic worldview, that dynamism gave way. Now, there are two examples that people use, that like to use, in regard to the so-called war between Christianity and science. And one is this story about the Library of Alexandria. So as I mentioned, the charge is made that that there's this historic Christian opposition to secular learning, and it's epitomized in part by this burning of 700,000 books in the library at Alexandria in 390 AD, or around 390 AD. But actually, that whole charge is actually a kind of an amalgamation of two different distinct events. And the first event was the actual burning of the royal library. So in Alexandria, there was a royal library. Like I said, we don't know how many volumes were in it. It could be anywhere from 40,000 and up. And it was apparently, from what we can tell from history, destroyed by fire, but it was done so by Julius Caesar in 47 BC. So in other words, it's done decades before even the beginning of the Christian era. This burning of the library occurs, okay? And even that is debated about by historians. And of course, as I mentioned, nobody really knows how many volumes were in the library. A lot of this stuff is historically obscure. So the actual number may have been far less than the 700,000 that Christians are accused of burning. Then there's a second event, which does happen in approximately 391 AD, in which some Roman soldiers, apparently with the assistance of some Christian civilians, may have, and I emphasize may have, again, historians don't know for sure, may have torn down and destroyed the Serapeum, which was an Alexandrian temple. So it's a temple in Alexandria that happened to be built on the site of the previous royal library. So the royal library is there, is destroyed in 47 BC, and then later this temple, this Serapeum temple, is built on the same site, okay? And then in 390 or 391 AD, these Roman soldiers, along with some Christian civilians, may have attacked this and destroyed this temple. And again, the history is not clear on that. But what is further not clear is whether or not there was even a library there at the time. So there's no mention in history of a library associated with the Serapeum. So if there was a destruction, it was a destruction of a temple, but there's no evidence at all of a destruction of a library. So this whole story about Christians destroying a library of 700,000 volumes is really made up out of whole cloth. So it was most likely, as I said, a military operation accompanied with civilians. It was not some kind of deranged riot like we're having today with people rioting in the last couple of weeks or so here in America. It was apparently nothing like that. And there may have been a library associated with the Serapeum, but we really don't have any evidence of that. We don't have any historical evidence of that. And then there's the case of Galileo, who's also mentioned. There are others, but these are kind of the two biggies, the Library of Alexandria and the case of Galileo. Because Galileo lived from 1564 to 1642. And in the early part of the 15th century, he published his defense of the Copernican theory. Copernicus, of course, proposed his heliocentricity, that the sun was the center of the solar system and the planets revolved around the sun. And Galileo published his defense of Copernicus's theory in his book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, the Ptolemaic and the Copernican. And this is actually a fictional dialogue. So he wrote it as a fictional dialogue between three people. And one of the people in the dialogue is clearly the Pope, okay? Now, Copernicus had published his theory in 1548 in a book called On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. So this is decades earlier. And Copernicus's theory, his heliocentric theory, largely went ignored after Copernicus published because most people just kind of blew it off. Oh, that's nonsense. And they just didn't really pay any attention to it until the 15th century, early part of the 15th century. And Galileo and some others start going, hey, wait a minute, this has some merit to it. But what we need to realize about Copernicus is that he was arguing that the sun was the center of the solar system and the Earth and the other planets revolved around the sun. And that part of his theory, of course, we now know was true. But almost everything else he wrote in explaining why it's true and justifying it by what they could see from the motion of the planets, virtually everything else he wrote in On Revolutions was mistaken. So his primary thesis of heliocentricity was true, but almost everything else he said about it was mistaken. And he could offer no proof. It was all theory, okay? And then Galileo comes along, and he actually secures permission from the church to publish his book on the Copernican model and to look at the Copernican model and to discuss it. And he does so in the form of this fictional dialogue that he creates. And in the fictional dialogue, as I said, one of the three characters in the dialogue who's taking the side of the Ptolemaic theory is a guy who very clearly represents the Pope. But Galileo gives him the name Simplico, which implies what? That the guy is a simpleton. So he's characterizing the Pope, who had been a friend of Galileo's. He characterizes him as this kind of idiot. And so all his arguments are idiotic and simplistic and that sort of thing. And so this creates this tremendous conflict then between these two titanic personalities. Galileo on one side, who has a tremendous ego, and Pope Urban VIII on the other side, who has a tremendous ego. So much of the conflict that goes on between the church and Galileo at this point is really a personality conflict between these two titanic egos. Well, of course, in hindsight, we realize that the church had no business meddling in these matters, okay? It had no business meddling in Galileo's scientific work. But on the other side, Galileo still faces the same problem Copernicus does. He doesn't have any proof for his theory. He has more data because he has a fancier telescope, has a telescope period now, and a better telescope than anybody else has and that sort of thing. But he couldn't offer proof for his theory. So the irony of this whole conflict between Galileo and the church at this point is that the church is demanding proof, and it's Galileo who's demanding blind faith. So it's really kind of a curious situation at this point in comparison to what we normally think of. So, but again, of course, Galileo was right. Scientifically, he was right, although at this point he had no proof. And the church really had no business interfering in this. And then, of course, so he is tried by the Inquisition and the Roman Inquisition, and he is arrested. But the myth is that Galileo is thrown into an Inquisition dungeon, and he lives in this dungeon for the rest of his life, and etc. In actuality, he was placed under house arrest, and he lived in this really luxurious villa for the rest of his life. And he had freedom to receive visitors. He continued to write, he continued to publish, and that sort of thing. So he was never really imprisoned. He was never tortured, as Voltaire claimed. And the other thing we need to keep in mind about Galileo is that there's this whole personality war between him and the Pope. And this generates a very unique situation, so that really the church's interference with Galileo is an exception rather than the rule. So as we've seen, the church historically has supported scientists, has supported scientific discovery, and that sort of thing. And so the situation with Galileo is really unique. It's not an example of an ongoing conflict. So finally, just a last couple thoughts. So what about this kind of tension that we oftentimes feel today between Christianity and our Christian faith and science? And I just want to remind you of a couple examples. One is, as we've talked about before, for a long time, scientists were convinced that the earth was eternal. And if you talk to a non-Christian or non-Jewish scientist, they would tell you that the cosmos had always existed. And that was the official position of science. And that seemed to run in direct conflict of Scripture. But of course, as we've seen, nowadays, most scientists recognize that the cosmos had a beginning point. Of course, some scientists are still trying to find a way around that because of its theological implications. But in reality, most scientists nowadays acknowledge, and cosmologists acknowledge, that the Christian belief in the beginning of a cosmos is correct scientifically. So here you have an example where there's been a tension in the past, and that tension has been resolved as science discovered more. Then, of course, we have Darwinian evolution. And of course, the dominant position of science today is Darwinian evolution. However, as we've seen, there's just relentless increase now in scientific discoveries that are calling into question the Darwinian model. So that even many Darwinians, leading Darwinians today, are beginning to say, wait a minute, we need to rethink this. We need to rethink this whole Darwinian method of random mutations and natural selection. We need to figure out a different vehicle. Okay. So it seems that scientific discovery is moving progressively towards the position that we as Christians have held for centuries. So the question then, just very quickly then, is how should we deal with the tensions that we do perceive or that do seem to exist today between science and our Christian faith, or science and the Bible? And I would just make 3 suggestions and we'll be done. One is, when we come across something that appears to be a conflict between science and Christian faith, one of the things we need to do is we need to think very carefully about the science, about the data, about the evidence. And we need to think about the claims that are being made from that evidence. Okay? So what is the actual evidence? And what does the evidence actually really imply? Because oftentimes scientists will take certain data and then they'll claim that it proves one thing when in actuality it may prove something entirely different. This goes all the way back to our arguments, to our lessons about argumentation and logic and things like that. So we need to be ready and willing to think very carefully about the scientific evidence and the scientific claims, and to what degree are they justified. The second thing we need to do as Christians is we need to think very carefully about how do we interpret Scripture. So is there really a conflict, or is there only a perceived conflict because my interpretation of Scripture is maybe not the best? So a classic example of this would be this issue of heliocentricity. So why was the church opposed initially? Why were many Christians opposed to heliocentricity? Because of the way they interpreted certain passages of Scripture about the rising of the sun and the stability of the earth and that sort of thing. Okay. But as Christians rethought that, in the light of the scientific evidence, they realized, okay, these passages are poetic or phenomenological. They're not to be taken literally, that the sun rises, that the sun runs its course, okay? So we need to honestly look at Scripture and ask ourselves, okay, if there's an apparent conflict here, is the conflict because the science is wrong, or is this conflict because I really am not properly interpreting Scripture? And then, if the tension persists, as Christians, we are bound to give the benefit of the doubt to Scripture. So if I do come across a conflict and I've thought carefully about the science and I'm pretty sure I'm interpreting Scripture correctly, then I'm going to place my bet on the Scripture. And I'm going to just wait for the science to grow and for the science to come around. So those are just some thoughts about our relationship with science. So we're actually a couple minutes over time there. So we need to go. Real quickly, does anybody have any questions? Everybody's pretty quiet.